All right. So first off, how's everyone doing this morning? Maybe just a quick kind of roll call of where everyone's coming from. I'm based in Calgary, Alberta right now, and we're in the middle of a Chinook, so the weather is great. 2 days ago it was minus 22, and I think last time I checked it was +1 or something like that. So you can either put it in the chat or just unmute your mic. I want to get a sense of where everyone's located.
This is Ian. Actually, it says Debbie Ostindi there, but I'll change that.
That's okay.
This is Ian Ostindi. I've been involved in communications directly or indirectly for years, but I'm a brand new town councillor in Sylvan Lake with a by-election this September. So thought I would, and this was a great topic for me in this context. Awesome. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks. Awesome. We're in BC, some other people from Alberta. Awesome.
I'm Kate Potter. Sorry, I don't have my camera on because I'm traveling right now.
Okay.
But it's Kate Potter. I'm the mayor of the town of Sexsmith up by Grand Prairie, Alberta. And it, like you in Calgary, we have hit some balmier weather after minus 35 and minus 40 earlier this week. Looking forward to the session today.
Perfect. Thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Okay. I'm going to get going here. So first of all, as with all of our presentations, I'd like to just start with a land acknowledgement. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Okay, for those unfamiliar with Alchemy, this is just a little bit of a breakdown of who we are. So we're a public relations, crisis communications and marketing firm, but we do a bunch of other things in addition to that. Those are the main public offerings that we provide, and we work with anywhere from municipalities to non-for-profits to small to mid-sized businesses. We really cover the wide spectrum of clients. So yeah, thanks again for joining us today. And there'll be a slide at the end that has my contact information if you'd like to reach out with any questions or any comments that you learned during this presentation, or if you just wanted to chat more, happy to do that. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about communication. So what is that? I mean, it's a loaded word. It can be anything from internal communications, external communications, digital communications. But right now, we're really going to focus on the big thing and the big, I guess, impetus for why we're having presentations like this and why members of municipalities or even other organizations are reaching out, because the big thing that we're noticing, and this shouldn't come as a surprise, is that digital communications and the way we digest information, share information, and get information is changing. In the past, municipalities and really organizations in general, anyone really, there was an ability to really control the message a lot more effectively. That could be attributed to a lot to just the time of which maybe messages are shared or information was digested. Usually in a time before social media, and even going way back, even before really the internet, the way information was shared was usually through media, whether that be radio, television, or newspaper print. There was always a time, some people might remember, where the way you got your news was you sat down at 6 o'clock and you'd watch the television news, or in the morning you'd get your morning paper delivered and you'd sit down with coffee, and that's how you get caught up, right? So it's really about understanding now that the times have changed. In that time, there was an ability to knowing that, okay, this is the news cycle, or this is the way we're getting this information out. There was time associated with that, and you could also control a lot more effectively. But in this digital age, any information can get out and will get out. So whether that's information that you're looking to get out there, or messaging that's you want to get to your, in this case with municipalities, your population, your constituents, your residents, you can control that. But also there's opportunity for information to be shared numerous ways by numerous people. And then with information comes misinformation and disinformation. So those are some terms that people may have heard of, but that means that really what that says is it speeds everything up. So you can't really wait anymore. Or sometimes in the past, it'd be like, we'll just kind of, I'm hearing this from a few people, but it wasn't really out there yet. So you can't really wait for these, we'll call them little mini storms, to pass. You have to be really on top of that. And that's not saying it's always a crisis situation, right? A lot of the presentation today will focus on crisis comms, but that really goes with communications in general. So if there's ever situations when you're wondering, oh, why isn't anyone talking about this? Or how come this announcement didn't really hit the mark that we expected? So you can go back, and we'll get to this in the presentation. Well, did you check all your boxes? Did you have a solid communications plan? Did you research your audience? Did you, I guess, find the channels of where they are? So a lot of kind of background goes into that. So gone are the days of sort of like, while still effective, utilizing media, there's so many other ways to get that message across. So one thing too that we're starting to see as things evolve and change is that it's not enough to just make statements or post messages. It's really about engaging now. It's about answering those questions that concerned residents have. It's about hearing from them and acknowledging. It's especially when we talk about social media, we'll get into it, but it's a two-way conversation. It's not just posting and then ignoring or not following up with questions. And that's one of the biggest things that can really build out and really, I guess, spur a potential crisis or communications crisis, is that lack of connection. So if someone is maybe posting a comment or sending a question via email or posting it on Facebook or sending a direct message and no one is responding, then that starts to kind of spur the negativity and gets that person on the other end maybe not as engaged and, quite frankly, upset. And then that could become the narrative. So you'll start to lose that trust. So that's one area that we'll talk about too, is that it's one thing to just put things out, but you do have to follow up. And again, with that communications planning and what that looks like, it's about you're creating relationships, right? So it's building upon that. And now that really, with this change in communication, there's opportunity to connect with people who may not have in the past. Maybe they didn't want to speak up at a town hall or call council, but they're more comfortable. And this is for good and bad, typing on a keyboard, right? So sometimes people get extremely confident, and that's when you start to see a lot of maybe misinformation or online bullying in all sorts of forums, but we'll touch on that. So it's really about understanding where we're at in terms of the landscape of communications. So it has definitely changed, and it will probably change in a year, 5 years from now, who knows? Okay, so the first thing that I always like to start with, whether you're starting from scratch in your communications planning, or if you have a plan that maybe, or a planning template, or a way that you've been doing things, and you like just to refresh or maybe just understand better, it's always good to go back or start from taking an inventory. So really understanding, what do you need, or what's lacking, or what do you have in place? What do you need to manage? And when I say manage, it could be just general communications. It could be crisis communications. It could be a little bit of, we get into this framework for internal communications, but that's we can have a whole other discussion on that. But it's really about understanding and taking the inventory and stock of what you need to manage communications as a whole. So we have it broken out into 4 sections here: documentation, training, technology, and people. And we'll just get into each one here. And please feel free, if you have questions, you can either use the chat as mentioned, or you can just unmute and kind of interrupt and we'll take it from there. Okay. So the first one we have here is documentation. So I use crisis a lot in these, but these are really interchangeable. You can use this for anything. So do you have a process for a potential crisis or even communications in general? Do you have it written down? Do you have it documented? Is there somewhere a document? Maybe I've seen plans that are anywhere from the templates could be 15 pages to 2 pages, or some organizations work with 1-pagers or briefing documents, but it's really important. Whatever style or process you're going to be using, you have to have that documented or written down. We often hear the term, especially sometimes I hear it like, well, what if I got hit by a bus tomorrow? I know that's super morbid, but it's to really understand that process. And also another main reason is to keep it consistent. If you have that communications process, if you get it as consistent as possible, then with that consistency, when you start getting those messages out there, when you start planning out your communications campaigns or dealing with crisis, there's a level of not only trust with the people you're reaching, but a level of comfortability with the people executing. So whether that's if you have a team, if it's you, if you're a team of one handling communications, I know it's all over the map when looking at municipalities. Some teams are bigger than others, or even if you're working with an agency such as Alchemy Communications, we work with plans too. So it's always good to have whatever that is, that plan that everyone understands and is on board with. So we'll get into that a little bit later of sort of what goes into those plans and what to look out for, but it's really about to have those processes and those plans written down or documented. In the past, sometimes people had binders, like communications process binders or crisis communications plans. Now with, again, that digital age, people can have them on shared drives, on cloud programs. If you have an intranet, they could live there as well, but it's just really important about having that document in place. So within that document, do you have the appropriate contacts listed? And when I say contacts, I mean internal. So if there's any approval processes, and then I'm going to use the word contacts as audience as well. So do you have the appropriate audiences / contacts listed or documented somewhere of what you're trying to achieve and accomplish? So again, once you have this and it's a living document working, you can add to it, detract from it, take away, again, build upon it as you go. But it's really important to capture that. So if you notice that maybe there is an audience that you haven't been connecting with in your municipality, maybe a group in a certain community that you wanted to target, put them in the plan or make note in the 1-page documents when looking at communications planning about how you can actually, what I like to do is almost rank your audiences in levels of importance. And not saying that the bottom one is not important, but there's going to be certain levels of who you need to communicate with, maybe in a more timely fashion or based on what information they need or require, right? So it's really about capturing those contacts and understanding who needs to know what. When we're talking about crisis communications, those contacts may look like stakeholders, maybe different heads of departments, different levels of government. So when we're talking with municipalities, maybe your contacts listed are your provincial representation, right? So what ministers need to know if there's a huge crisis situation, just have all that documented and in place. Again, we're kind of getting to that crisis situation scenario, but we do offer training and courses on that we can get in that really dives into what those plans look like. But for the general broad, just communications and planning in general, it's important to have those audiences listed. Do you have any pre-approved messaging? Anything like sometimes we hear the term, or you hear the term key messages or mission statements or vision. It's always important to have those not only captured somewhere, but in the plan so you can refer back to them. One thing that I find that you can sometimes get in trouble with is if you're speaking against your messages, or if you're sometimes something might not be jiving, and so you might get called out and say, well, if you're talking about your community being transparent and this and that, then why are you hiding something or something like that, right? So it's always important to have those pre-approved larger statements kind of at the top of your general plan. And then if there's communications plans based on different campaigns or scenarios or things, actions you're taking. It's good to have those and then build out separate messages based on those. Does your team or team of one, do you understand the approach, the process, or sort of that way things roll out? So in this regard, we say approves messaging before it goes out, but is there a cadence of when to post? Who's posting to social media? Who's the media contacts? How are we reaching those? So it's really about getting all these details and kind of chain of command things and steps in the planning and the process. So again, with those timelines and everything, what is the expectations around that? Is there an expected turnaround of 1 to 2 days? Is it an hour to 2 hours? I've seen organizations that are public, and especially in municipalities too, especially sometimes with social media, they put right on there, thank you for your comment, we'll get back to you within 24 hours, or someone will get back to you, this is ambitious, within the hour, right? But it's always good, especially when we're dealing with communications and talking to the public, to set that expectation of turnaround time, because you just don't want to leave it, or almost leave the audience to their own devices and where they're thinking and wondering, oh, when are they going to get back to me? Or it's been 2 days and no one's getting back to me, or it's been 2 weeks and no one's getting back to me. But maybe if you would have set your expectations, someone will get back to you. And I know this is a long timeline, but saying 2 weeks, then there's a little bit of leeway there. So it's always good. I'm always of the mind, the quicker you can get it handled, the better. But if circumstances dictate that your timelines are a little bit longer, just make sure that you're communicating that to your audience. And by audience, I say even internal as well. So if someone on the team or at different levels doesn't understand, well, this person called and they called me and no one got back to him, what's going on? There could be some division there. So if everyone is on the same page of kind of that process of handling communications, it just makes for an easier conversation internally and externally.
Okay.
Okay. Just a quick reminder too, if you are on mic and you're not speaking, I just ask that you mute. It's just good for everyone here. So next step here is training. So I guess the biggest thing when we're talking about training is we always hear this comment or question, like, you only know what I know, or you don't know what you don't know. So the important thing to recognize is, whether we're dealing with crisis or just communications planning in general, has your team, or have you briefed or followed up on those plans? Do you understand what you're trying to achieve when it comes to communications training, or even communications plans or planning in general? Do they know where the documentation is? Do they know that even a plan exists? So it's one thing to put together a plan, but if it just sits there and it's never used, or you kind of use it sometimes, then it doesn't really achieve what it set out to do. So I always recommend, when you're looking at communications planning or building out those communications plans, it's good to have review processes as well as training processes with your team. So whether that's, again, if it's a team of 2 or a team of 20, it's always good to go through and ask questions, and also get feedback and maybe build out areas that you may not have captured in the original plan. So kind of dovetailing off that second point of where all the documentation is, has your team reviewed the processes? And again, it's always good to review these plans and maybe add things that you may have missed. Like I said, if there's a certain section for potential new audiences, or if there's new issues that are bubbling up, maybe it needs to be reflected in the style of communication or the way you're delivering that. So that needs to be captured in the plan. Have you trained backups? And people might say, well, I wish I had backup. That'd be great. We just don't have resources. But if you do, if you're in those positions, is there backup? So and this mainly relates to a lot with crisis comms, but is there someone who is able to again, step in or provide support if you need to be pulled in different directions, or if there's scenarios that dictate that you really have to build out or build upon your communications? Are there any questions so far?
Actually, I had one question, just in terms of, now we have cloud technology, and that is an awesome backup, not terms of backup of trained people, but backing up of the documents themselves. Do organizations still rely on some paper binders literally in the offices, as we say, in the typical organization? I know I've worked in schools, and we always do, and often when the crisis is there, we're racing out the building. The crises might be a natural disaster where you lose network connections, although cloud technology still is better, but still, if you lose, say, cell towers in your area, now you've really lost all network. So I'm just curious about that best practices nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I had a client recently who couriered over the binder. They didn't even have it on a digital copy. So I think the best practice, and you made a good point, like what if your technology goes down? I guess it's really dependent on your business or your municipality or your group too, about if you require maybe a need for that paper copy or that binder copy. Sometimes we had a client who not everyone was on the cloud or had access to it. So they actually had like printed paper copies of everything from all their training documents, right? So again, maybe that's something you identify in when you're building out your communications plan of how are we going to deliver the plan, right? So how do we keep a paper copy? Do we keep only on the cloud, vice versa? Who has access? Stuff like that. So great question. Anything else? Okay. Nice little segue into technology. So especially now, you can really expect that communication, it's gone are the days where someone maybe showing up, and they still do this, like show up to council meetings or call on the phone. Now it's a lot of engagement. Usually you'll find email is the first one, or social media, or you'll see a message, maybe a question or concern. But now it's really about technology is king in terms of getting that communication and opening those lines of communication, right? So expect for your community to be able to reach you in digital spaces. And when I say expect, you should encourage that as well. So if you don't have these tools, I suggest, and a lot of people do, and even if you do have it, it's about understanding. So yeah, we have a Facebook page, but what is that? How do we use it? Yeah, we post, or I think someone tweets once in a while, but what are we saying? Who monitors it, right? So it's really about taking that technology and understanding what we have available to us, but also and on the flip side, what do we not need? Like sometimes there's always these questions. And I remember when sort of social media was just starting to kind of bubble up in terms of a communications tool and ways to connect with audiences. And it was a matter of sometimes people were saying, or corporations or clients would say, oh, we need a Facebook page, or we need a Twitter account. And it's like, well, why do you need it? What is there needs to be a reason, right? So it's really good to understand what the goal is in terms of connecting. So you can ask that same question. Okay, so who do we want to connect with on social? Do we want to connect with this certain demographic? Well, okay, maybe Facebook is the way to go in that regard. Are we trying to reach a younger demographic? TikTok, let's do TikTok, right? So it's really about understanding the platforms and how we can utilize and use them. So everything from social media, like the actual tools, to sometimes, so I guess the ground level is your social media accounts, so Facebook, Twitter, but then the deeper you go and the more you get kind of into this planning and recognizing and detailing of what you need to do, there's all different tips and tricks and tools. You can have automated messages where it's, if certain people go down this path, they get this message, stuff like that. So some of you may be familiar with different things like that, but it's just really good to understand what technology is available and out there. So when we're talking about communications in municipality settings, some tools that we often use are survey tools. So SurveyMonkey is one that's available. So if you're looking to get feedback on projects, or if there's maybe even what you could do is have, if you're at an event, you have what we've done too, is have people with tablets and they have the survey right there and they capture and take it. So that's all technology that improves communication. Media monitoring software, some of you may be familiar with that. So if sometimes, usually when you're using media monitoring, it's because you're in the media. So whether that's positive or negative, or could be you're just coming off an election, you want to see what they're saying about results or anything like that. That's a good way to gauge sort of how the media is covering, and not only the media is covering, but what your audiences are taking in and digesting, right? So when we're talking about crisis comms, that's a way to kind of get ahead or understand the gravity of a certain situation. If it's starting to blow up on social and then it's making its way into media, and media is using the narrative on social media, you need to be aware of that, especially if it could be incorrect. So again, not getting too far into communications on how to handle our crisis communications and how to handle that. But if you don't even know what's happening because you don't have a media monitoring tool, or you don't have the steps to monitor or look for that in a plan, then it can come as quite a shock later down the road. Okay, and one of the areas too here is people. So again, we talked about some organizations, groups, municipalities have a team. Others don't, and those are probably the envy of the one-man shows. But if you do have a team and you do have those people that you can leverage, it's a great thing to have. But one thing that you need to be aware of is that people are different. We're not all the same. We don't all communicate the same. We don't all monitor the same. We don't write the same. We're not robots, right? So sometimes, especially when we're trying to do things that are, so when I talk about planning and regimented and you have to have these steps, there's also a huge area that you need to understand, is that understanding that people are different. So investing in these skills of people or teams. So one way to do that is through personality assessments, or a DISC. I don't know if anyone has heard of those DISC personality testings, or sometimes you've seen ones where they fit in different color codes or stuff like that. So that's a great way to really understand who may be the best suited to maybe handle the monitoring of a situation, or maybe this person is an amazing writer, so that they can maybe they have the ability to get that message down. So maybe you lean on them for not just crisis situation messaging, but just community messaging in general, or if there's something that you wanted to get out there. It's really about leveraging those people and not trying to fit them in. Okay, we need to do communications. Well, you do this, and it just doesn't make any sense to that person or to you, and it could lead to frustration, right? And it could lead to mixed messages on the other side. So when you're talking about looking at those people, it's investing in that and familiarizing yourself with the assessment tools. This next slide sort of kind of goes into a breakdown of the DISC assessment and sort of a quick snapshot on that. I just had a quick question come in on the chat. What media monitoring tools would you recommend? There's a bunch out there right now. We are currently using Meltwater. That's one that we've used for quite some time, and it's really good. It gives you a good idea of it monitors pretty much the world globally, right? So, but again, very broad, but you can dive down and get local as well. So there's Meltwater, there's Critical Mention is another one, Cision, Muckrack. There's a bunch. What I'll do is when I send the presentation at the end to everyone who attended today, I can send you a list of resources as well. But that's a great question. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a quick little exercise here, and it's just kind of to go through this and just think who would be best suited to maybe handle some scenarios of communications. So we kind of have this little chart of breakdowns here of extroverted, people-oriented, introverted, task-oriented. And this is taken from the DISC assessment, where you can see the D, I, S, and C. So dominant, characteristics of that dominant communication style: direct, firm, strong-willed, forceful, result-oriented. Influencing, so some characteristics there are outgoing, enthusiastic, optimistic, high-spirited, and lively. Steady is even-tempered, accommodating, patient, humble, and tactful. Compliant is analytical, precise, reserved, private, and systematic. And you can kind of see as they go down in the charts, the extroverted, introverted, of where they kind of fit on that. So I'm just going to run through a few kind of questions, and either by chat or even just unmuting your mic, just looking at this, and we can use the first letter of each one. So CSD or DIS and C. Who would be kind of best served to maybe handle a communications function? So the first one I'm going to throw out there, who would write the best press release? So looking at those, who do you think would, in that communication style, and not saying they are the best person to do it, so only focus on those people, but just by looking at that, who do you think would be the best served to maybe write a media release? Compliant, got that one. Okay, any others? All right, so for whoever said compliant, ding, 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 ding. And I also would have accepted S. So compliant or steady. And some reasons for that is when you're looking at messaging, and we're using the term press release, but this can be from all messaging, you want someone who has all those traits, right? So is very analytical, precise, is looking at the messages more than just words, right? So what does this mean? And then if you kind of go into that steadiness, someone who is even tempered and depending on the message you're writing isn't getting an emotional response of what they're writing. I find sometimes that if you're too invested in something, or if you're too close to the scenario, you can start to kind of sway that message that can be perceived as kind of starting to kind of go into that world of opinion, and it's starting to, you're showing your colors, right? So if you're having someone who is that even tempered and can kind of just look through it and say, okay, no, this is what it is. This is what we have to say. I may not agree with it personally, but it's irrelevant right now. What are we doing? So it's really about having those people in those positions. So like, could you imagine if there was maybe, again, and this happens, if someone who is the more dominant style, direct, firm, and they're writing a message to the community, and maybe it could be in response to a question or something, and it could be perceived as taken as too direct, right? Or insulting almost. So it's really about understanding those nuances of communications. And the more you can invest, and I know it's hard because time is tight and even resources are tight, but the more you can try and understand this, even down to the people level, it'll help a lot. Okay, so this next one here who would be the best networker? So in terms of communications, who's the one that you get out there to engage with community? Who would be the person to sort of, maybe they're the MC for your community events, or they're the ones directly answering the questions? And who would be that best networker? We got influencing, correctamundo. And I think that one was pretty self-explanatory, or easy when I say out there and outgoing. That's the first ones, right? Enthusiastic and outgoing. But again, you'll kind of get a sense of where I'm going with this. It's really about when we get to the level of communications planning, there's always people behind these executables or deliverables. So who is best served to really work in their area of expertise or their areas of genius as well, right? So, okay, and the final one here, we're going to go with one, who would write the most empathetic statements or messages? So this is kind of sort of into that same realm as the first one, but bang on. Yep, steady. I got that in the chat. Yep, steady. Awesome. So it sounds like we got a good handle of that. It's exactly what that, if you look up empathy and empathetic, like I would want my steady hand writing those statements for even the reasons that I mentioned in the first example, right? So there has to be that level of patience, especially critically when we're dealing in communications, not only just crisis, but even communications in general. Because sometimes there can be a level of frustration, and that could just be because people may not understand, or just so it doesn't have to be that there's any ill will or anything. It just could be a lack of understanding, right? So awesome. Okay, great job on that. Thanks again. And there's going to be a few other opportunities to interact and engage. So I really appreciate to the people who participated. Thank you very much. Okay, so these next few slides here and this next portion of time we're going to spend on this topic here is really about understanding those channels, what I talked about before. So you went through the communications plan, you understand what we need to do, how we're going to communicate, who we're going to communicate with, who we're maybe not going to communicate with, who's communicating, who's doing what, who's the person who's best served to handle social, who's the best person to do the website. So now it's understanding those lines of communication and those channels. So really about, and I mentioned it before, is keeping those lines not only open, but it's two-way. So the community, the audience, the voters, the constituents, the residents, they need to know where they can reach you and how they can reach you. And again, back to that expectation of timeliness and when they can expect to hear back from you. So that can go anywhere from that auto reply on a message saying we'll get back to you within 24 hours. It could go from maybe setting up where I know some councils do this. They do coffee with the mayor every Tuesdays or every Wednesday. So that's in their brain, in their minds, that it's ingrained. Okay, I have a chance to communicate at that time. Or every Tuesday or every Wednesday at noon, you're going to be I get the newsletter. So it's really about understanding and building up that consistent cadence of communication. Look at that alliteration for you there. So it's about not only when you do that, it improves your workflow, and you almost get in a groove and you're kind of cooking, you're moving forward, but it gets everyone else that you're communicating with on board, and it starts to eliminate that question or when are they going to reach out to me, or when can I hear about this? If you consistently have that, those questions are gone. So it's, again, when you do that, it starts to build trust. When you have trust, when there are negative or maybe crisis style situations, it's a lot easier to navigate and communicate that. If you don't have that and you're faced with a crisis situation, it's a lot easier for people to maybe get fired up, and they could just be upset. Say if something happens and you didn't have these processes and channels in place, they could say, well, if they communicated with us, we'd know, and this wouldn't even happen. But on the flip side, if you have all this, it could be the flip narrative. Oh, I'm so thankful that they communicate this. They're really great in connecting with us. Awesome job, right? So that's the level. And there's it's not an all or nothing. There's levels of that, right? So, but that would be I guess if we're talking gold standards, where you want to get to, right? And I don't think anyone is ever really there, because there's always going to be things you can improve and build upon. So getting back to sort of those lines of communication and looking at those platforms, we kind of broke them out into a few examples here. So website, social media, and then media relations, or I guess we could say engagement as a whole. Okay, so when looking at your website, and these are just some base questions here. Does your website load in 2 seconds or less? So responsive time. If it's slow, excuse me, or it's hard to navigate, that could be a deterrent. Is it mobile responsive? Can users find the information they need? Do your contact forms work? Sometimes they could be dead links, or they go to email inboxes that aren't checked or haven't been checked in years. So that could be, it's all little things to check when you're building out these plans. Again, do the forms work? Or are the phone numbers and email addresses correct? One thing, clickable? Do they go to the right places? One thing that I've seen is that sometimes people maybe get a little backwards or ahead, and they just throw up the general or reception phone number, and then that can cause confusion in communication, because if the people that are receiving that call don't understand of where to direct certain things, that could be a whole other mess, right? So it's really about marrying all these different things, all this technology, all this planning, all this. I know it could be, sounds daunting, but it's really about getting it all on the same page, and especially when it comes to communication, all these things. So if you said no, these could be seen as negatives and turnoffs for audience members, right? So especially if you're trying to rebuild trust or get those messages out that haven't been getting out, and these are kind of deterrents, they're going to set you back. If you make 2 steps forward, then something like this may set you back 3 steps, right? So it's really about understanding technology and making sure it's accurate and correct. Okay, social media. So are your handles consistent? So an example, maybe the town of Drew, and there is there is a place, but just say Drew. So the town of Drew, are their social handles at town of Drew? One might be at Drew Township, at Drew Municipality. If there's an inconsistency across that, one thing that it can lead to is that people, again, it erodes that trust. They may not understand if this is even the right channel. But if they're all consistent and you're promoting the fact they're consistent, then people know that, okay, I'm talking to the official person here. And if you're, again, if we're going back to the planning, if you're quick in responding, if you're doing it on a positive way, then it's all building and to that positive communications. Are your comments open? So in some situations, you strategically may want to close them. I'm not saying it's an all or nothing, but for the most part, is there, what I should say by this is there an ability for people to share comments, concerns, questions? If you're just locking everything down because you're afraid of a potential scenario or a question, that could have a negative impact. I'd much rather suggest that you have it open, but you have a plan on how to address these questions, good, bad, indifferent, right? Rather than just shutting it all down for a fear of having to deal with it, right? That's probably one of the worst things you can do, is next to ignoring is not even giving the opportunity. That being said, if the comments are open, or if there's opportunity to send direct messages, if there's an email inbox, and again, this goes back to the planning and the people side of it, who's checking it? Does anyone check it? Right? Or is it just there and it's just left? Or oh, I saw someone commented, what do we do? So how are you handling those responses? I know I mentioned sometimes you can set up an automated response where it says, thank you for your question. Someone will get back to you in X number of time, or our offices are currently closed. Those are good as the initial first kind of acknowledgement, but you shouldn't just rely on that, right? So it should be, okay, we see that, and then there should be another follow-up or direction, and then make it really personal or directed. Oh, thank you so much, Susan, for your question. I understand your concern about wastewater, whatever. I've directed it to our director of infrastructure and operations, stuff like that. So it's about understanding, okay, who is the person to respond to Susan? Who do they direct them to? Okay, infrastructure operations, or whoever it may be. Or so it's just understanding that process as well. Do you post regularly? It's one thing to have this communication channel, but if you're posting once every 6 months or 2 weeks and it's only the same message and it's not there's no two-way communication, or you're not engaging, then you're gonna run the risk of turning people off from that channel, or not taking it seriously, or again, you're going to hear me say trust. It's an erosion of that trust. So if you're regularly posting, regularly communicating, you're building that trust with people. And it's no different than just even, and I talked about communication styles changing and the way we do things is moving digital, but it's the same thing as if you were interacting face to face. So if someone asks you a question and you just head down, walk by them, like, what's the message is that going to send, right? So, or if you just see them every 6 months and you say the same thing, and it sounds kind of funny if you picture that, but it can be very, very similar in social media and digital communications as well. Okay, so as part of the communications planning process, there's a big component of this in reaching our audiences is media relations. And even just, I'm going to put a hyphen or a slash next to that. Is even you can use all these in terms of community engagement or engaging your community. So do your press releases or messages go out, and in this case for media, in the morning are the best times, but do they go out in timely fashions that make sense for your audience? Are you sending out your community newsletter or your social messages at times that are making sense for the community as a whole? Or like you're not sending them out at 10 o'clock at night and then wondering, how come no one responded or read this yet? Well, maybe there might be a better way if you did it at 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 10 a.m. Like finding that niche of where your audiences are and what time, right? So in relation to media, so are you available to comment after you send out a release? And on the flip side, if you send out a tweet or a message, is someone available to answer those questions or comments? One of the biggest things I hear when I'm working with reporters, and if you send out a release and they call you, and the biggest pet peeve for them is, so you send out a release and you say this big issue or this event or story or whatever it is, so-and-so is available for an interview or comment. If they call back and you say, yeah, well, they're not really available today, but tomorrow, like obviously there'll be time and scheduling, but you should have that time tight right when it goes out. So, or even just have that schedule even listed right in the release of the availabilities. So, because what that's saying is like, well, we want you to cover this, but it's not really important enough for us to make the person available to comment. So then, again, it goes all the way back to that planning, understanding who is doing what, who is going to respond. And again, it dovetails. I could do 15 workshops on every little component. So there's media training, who's the media spokesperson, how to handle that. So it's really about understanding the process around that. And then that final point, it kind of goes back to those processes and steps is, does media or / community, do they have that line or that way to the right person? It could be one thing to put someone out there, but again, if it doesn't fall in line with those, who's doing what and who's better served to do this, it could have negative impacts and it could affect the communication. If they're not saying the message that you wanted to get out there, if there's confusion, then it's, again, 3 steps forward or 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So it's really about understanding that that communication process. It's not just writing a message or a statement or sending a release. It's understanding the why behind it. Who are we trying to reach? Why are we writing this? Do we even have to write this? Do we even have to have a Twitter account? Stuff like that. So just really understanding those questions. And it can be intimidating sometimes too, especially if you're in situations where you're being directed to do this, or it's hard if someone says, no, well, I saw someone do it this way, or this is the way I've always done it. I challenge you to push back, and the ways you can do that is through research and understanding of the process. Okay. So this really kind of this encompasses everything in terms of communication. So whether you're building the plan, when you're in the middle of the plan and you're in a campaign, or you've kind of in your deliverables of communication and you're getting those messages out there, or you're doing media interviews, or you're engaging, whatever that looks like. Don't just speak, learn to listen. So this is, if you write anything down from this presentation, I would write down that line, because you can put that actually right at the top of your plan. Don't just speak, learn to listen, because what that does is it says that if communication only goes the one way, if you're only just shouting those messages, you're not properly communicating. If you're not taking in that feedback, if you're not understanding what is the real issue, or what do people, and it doesn't even have to be negative, it's just, what are people talking about? That's what you need to really be focusing on. So in terms of this presentation, when we're talking about municipalities, it's what your community, what are they saying to you? What do they think? How are they responding to things? What are they, if you send out a campaign that you think might be amazing, and they're saying, you didn't really hit the mark, you should listen to them. Don't take it as negative or negativity. Sometimes it can be hard especially if you put something out there and you're like, oh, it just didn't hit the mark. Well, why? What's the reason? So it's about understanding that. And then on the flip side, show them that they've been heard, show them that maybe, okay, in-person events aren't the way to go. Maybe we move things to Zoom online because 98% of people who responded to the survey that we created, which was because it was in our plan. See what I'm doing there? So it's really about getting all those things and those things, setting up those channels to understand your community as well. So a big thing here too is if your community tries to express something to you and it feels like you didn't hear them, or you're ignoring, or maybe they've sent a message, and if you didn't set that expectation of response time, then they're left in the dark. You're losing that, and go back to that word again, that T word, trust. You're losing it, and you're starting to get into that level where you're going to be calling me up because you're in a crisis situation that could have been avoided if you had. And I'm not saying there'll never be crisis, but if you take steps in your communications planning, it's a lot easier when you look back and you're like, man, if we just would have acknowledged, right? And not saying that's always the case, because sometimes there's people that no matter how much you respond back, they're never happy with the answer. I asked the question, do we want to focus on that group? Or do we want to focus on maybe the 80% of people who care, right? Or are open to that, right? So. Okay. Okay, so has anyone ever heard or seen a similar kind of diagram like this, the ladder of inference? So it's basically your beliefs affect the way you kind of handle things, or your data or your experiences in the future. Has anyone, maybe by a show of hands or just on the chat, seen something like this? Okay, not seeing much. That's okay. I can kind of explain. We're going to have a quick little exercise here that's more of like a personal kind of reflection. Okay, no, I haven't seen. Yes, I've seen. Okay, sweet. So basically the way this works is everything is kind of plotted out on a ladder of ways you take things in, right? So how do you handle your objective data and experiences, and then all the way up? So we'll go down the ladder. I take action, I adopt beliefs, I draw conclusions, I assume based on these meanings, I add to the meaning to the data, I select data from what I observe, and that all kind of goes into that ladder of inference here. Okay, so quick little exercise here. We won't spend a huge amount of time, but it just kind of gets us into that mindset of when we're looking at communication and how we're taking things in. So whether that's a message from the community, or whether that's maybe a council person or the mayor wants you to draft a message based on this. How do you take this all in, right? So maybe think back to one of the last times that you had a strong reaction to feedback, especially if maybe it was defensive. So really understand that. Okay, so put yourself in that mindset of what happened, how you sort of reacted to it. Now, looking at this ladder, plot your journey up that ladder of inference and kind of take those steps. What meaning did you assign to maybe those when we say data, what was happening, right? So what assumptions did you make? What conclusions did you draw? Did you assume that, if we're talking about the reaction of defensiveness, did you assume that it was negative, that you did something wrong? Or again, this kind of goes back to that person, if they're steady Eddie and they can just handle everything, maybe you want them writing the messages, right? So kind of go through this, and we don't have to share. It's just kind of you can even screenshot it, or when I send around the tool, you can print this out and have it on your desk or whatever. But it's always good to understand how you kind of go through these and understand what that feels like when you're making those assumptions or inferences, right? So when you go through this and you think back maybe at a scenario, how could that have been different if you've been intentional? And when I say intentional, what you can say too is, what if I had a plan, right? Or the communications plan. So what may have changed if you were kind of going intentional around these? So, okay, I want to really, I'm not just assuming this, but I'm okay, I'm in this level now. What does that look like? Am I adding meaning to this? What do I have to bring to this? What is actually happening? So I know it sounds like it's kind of pie in the sky, high stuff, but it's always good to really just sit with this and think, because again, when we're talking about especially crisis situations or crisis communications, there's always this factor of time, or it's like there's a level of, okay, we got to react right now. But if you don't kind of go through the steps or understand what is actually happening, you might miss things, or you might go down the different road or draw a conclusion that may not have been accurate. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so this next section here is sort of the I guess the first few slides or steps of when we really start getting into the crisis communications. And I really wanted to include this because I really do feel that it's important to understand this, especially because you can use this information and these tips and steps for anything, any style of communication, whether it's with community members, whether it's internally. It's really just hinges and centers around preparedness. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is that they assume that as long as they know, everyone knows, right? So as if they know kind of what's going on, then everyone should understand or read their mind, right? As long as they know what they can walk into anything and you'll be able to just nail it, which isn't necessarily the case. And I shouldn't say necessarily, probably isn't the case 9 times out of 10. There still needs to be a level of preparation around that. So again, that goes back to that planning of, okay, so we have a section of media relations, media components. Well, who is speaking to media? What are they saying? How are they communicating? What are the key messages that they're keying in on? What do they want to key in on? So you may have all this information in your head, but what might happen if you don't prepare, you could come across as being just jumbled, everything. You're just talking, whoa, like just all this stuff, and everyone is just confused. So in this example, we say media, but sometimes reporters could get you back on track. But on the flip side, they could lead you down a path of potential crisis issues if you're not prepared. So if you flip the media side and you say maybe just communications in general, and you're putting out a message, and it's a message that's, so say we're putting it on the website, you're scrolling down and the thing is just huge because it has everything you want it to say in it, because you feel that that's what needs to get out there. It could have the opposite effect. I'd much rather, so if you prepare, you chunk it out, maybe you release different sections at certain times, or you have all that information in different sections of the website, or you create a new interactive web page based on this project that has all these little tools. So it's really about understanding and planning, not just knowing it, but how are we going to deliver that, right? And again, it could be daunting because with that, it's time, it's resources, it's energy. It's easier just to say, well, I just know it, I'll do it, it's fine. So, but again, you run the risk of confusion and losing that trust again with audience. So when we get to that point, again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about these laundry list things of what you want to say. When you sit down, you say, okay, I have a media interview, or we want to launch this new initiative to our residents. Define into those points, or those 3 to 5 key messages or points that you want to cover, and try not to stray away from those. So whether the initiative is these 3 to 5 points, don't start bringing in other stuff from other initiatives that might confuse, and you'd be like, well, what do you mean? Well, no, I just said that because it's sort of like this thing. Just take that out. It might make sense to you at the time, but for the audience and what we're trying to achieve, just define those and get those into those 3 to 5 key points or key messages. And again, as media examples, but you can use these in any facet of communication. Try to speak in sound bites that are short, but offer the impactful answers or the information that can stand alone. So whether that's a written soundbite, that sounds kind of weird, but or a soundbite in an actual media interview. Make sure they're easily digestible and someone reads it, hears it, they understand and know what's going on. prepare to, I shouldn't say redirect. Well, it's prepare to provide the answers to the questions to the right people, right? Or if you're not best served, you can bring that back to your key point or message, right? This is, you will notice this a lot if you watch like traditional media interviews on news TV, and you can tell when someone is really probably sat with a guy like me, right? Talked about key messages and what to say, get back on message, back on point. When you hear those terms like what matters most now, or right now it all boils down to this. Great question. We're here to talk about that. Like, you can tell, right? So it's really about understanding kind of what we're trying to achieve and focus in on the communication. So we're gonna come back to this, and we have a little mini exercise, a few slides down here that we're gonna come back to. But I just want to kind of plant the seed and think in these short kind of soundbite things and define, kind of thinking, okay, if we're defining these messages, try to stick to the three to five key points of those. So this could go again across all lines of communication, even when you're writing the plan. So you got to be very conscientious of the language that you're using as well. There's a few things in here that directly are when you're on camera and in public scenarios. This is all relevant to communication. So when you're talking, I guess in an interview or even in a public space, or if someone called you on the phone and you're the person who's handling this situation, when the ums and the ahs happen, it starts to discredit. It starts to give people those moments like, do they know what they're talking? Like, am I talking to the right person here? Like, what's going on? So they happen. I mean, it's a natural reflex of some people. That's the way, that's their thinking. That's the word they use when they're processing, right? But so sometimes people are aware of that and they want to change it. Sometimes not. It's fine too, but it's just to be aware of that. So sometimes maybe just take a break, close your mouth, stop, regroup, right? And this is again more so around the media side of things when you're in an interview, but it can be reflected and used in any meeting situation. This one here is about basically some of the tips when you're on camera and stuff. So keep your hands between waist to shoulder height. Higher seems that so sometimes you've seen interviews and they're usually ending up on YouTube for like a blooper or something. Did you see this guy they interviewed? He's all doing this and you should have seen that. And it's like, holy smokes, man. Which can be effective in some cases, but sometimes depending on the situation, if you're maybe the counselor and you're talking about a project, you're doing this, it could have the opposite effect, right? So on the flip side, if you're more lower, it seems like you if you're kind of slunched over, it's that lack of confidence. So again, these tips can be used not only in communication, but in public speaking and anything, right? So sometimes it's good to just take these little tips and use them as practice in life as well. So sometimes too, you often run when we're especially engaging in communication when we're talking publicly, or you're communicating maybe through an interview, or even if you're posting videos on your website, you probably feel, and sometimes people think that they're speaking faster than you are. If you think you're speaking fast, you're probably speaking 10 times faster. So take your time, slow down, process. Again, understand your audience. If you're addressing a community address where you have to be slower, and we often see this in State of the Union addresses and politics, it's knowing that audience, right? So it's really about understanding, again, all the way back to the plan. If you're identifying that that's an area that your spokesperson, you're stuck with them, that if that's something they need to work on, then you identify, right? And then finally, whether not only you're talking to media or whoever you're talking with, you're the expert, and I will empower you. Even if you're not the top of the food chain of the organization, if you're in that situation where you're answering the question, or you're doing the interview, or you're responding to a post, at that moment in time, you are the expert of that because you prepared yourself to be. So you are you like empower yourself to do that, right? Because you planned, you've written your messages, you know. Okay.
Sorry, can I
Okay.
just ask a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
It's sort of related to that. So I've had the scenario previous to me being mayor, which hopefully is not the scenario now that I am mayor, but where the person who, like, automatically within a lot of municipalities, the mayor is the designated spokesperson for council, but sometimes is not the best option.
Yeah.
Just because of their either personality or even comfortability with public speaking or things like that. And so does it erode public trust if you have somebody else as the designated communicator? And I know in times of crisis, people look for the mayor or deputy mayor to come out, but if that's not the best person, is there an erosion of trust if you designate someone else as that person?
As long as you're clear of the intent and the reason behind it, and depending on your relationship, like sometimes I've seen, it's like, you know what, I'm not the best to speak to this, he's my guy, right? So then you kind of build that. But if it can be perceived as if you're coming across as hiding something, or, oh, the mayor's not talking because it directly affects her, of course not. But it's really based on the scenario and putting that out there in the open too. So even if that was a question, I would maybe even recommend like saying, you could say something like, I know there are a lot of questions as to why I'm not speaking to this issue, and no, it is not because of this. It's because my deputy mayor is firmly my expert and my person on this, and I trust. So however you want to word it, but it's, again, just making sure and building that understanding out there that is why it's happening and being clear on it. So okay, thanks for the question.
I was just thinking about that question, and your answer too is, like, even if the mayor isn't talking and someone else is, whether it's staff or another member of council, if the mayor's present, that gives an endorsement to that person too. So I could imagine a perception of still being trust, and the mayor's endorsing it. The mayor is saying it through them, in effect, yeah, without even using the word sometimes.
And that's a really good point, because sometimes too, and this goes back to even when you're planning, or if you're having maybe town hall events and you're wondering who should go or who shouldn't go, even being there could be you may not have to say a word, yeah, but just having that, oh, the mayor showed up, this is important, right? Or the flip side, oh, the mayor didn't show up, they don't care about me, or they don't care about our community, stuff like that, right? So it's really about planning and understanding. So it goes all the way back to those. But thanks for sharing. Thanks. Okay, so back to building those messages and understanding kind of what the intent of these are and how that helps the communications planning. What it does is it sort of sets, it's like the anchor of your plan. It really, it's that beacon that you kind of, everything sort of revolves around these messages. So when you have those messages, or those statements, or the message, or the one point maybe of a campaign or an initiative you're trying to get out there, it really hinges around everything. And that's the one thing you can hold on to. So if you have something and there's so many different messages or questions, and it's out of control and there's no plan, and that opens you up to really more questions around it. So it's like, well, what do you mean that? Well, if you had that tightened up plan, this is the message, it all revolves back to that. So it's really about understanding these points here. So the audience, the issue, the incident, the event, the initiative, the topic, whatever it is. And then the last and final point is everything after that. So what's the next steps of that? So when you're developing your messages, and when you're talking about your message or your key beacon points, what's the follow-up to that? So what is the next step when maybe you announce that there's going to be, we're going to be tearing down this beloved building? So what do we, how are we going to handle that? What are the next steps? Are we looking for community feedback on maybe what to do to make the space better? Are we past that, where everyone's just, we're in crisis mode, we need to focus on that? So really it's about understanding everything that you're communicating, but also the following after that, which might lead to new key messages, new plans. So it's an ever evolving thing. So getting into these bullet points here a little bit deeper. So it's understanding those audiences, and I'll use that example of the building crowd maybe. So you're trying to communicate to them, what do they value? It sounds maybe they value the history or the historical context of the municipality. So how do they feel about this issue? Well, they hate it. It's brutal. That building has been there for 75 plus years. It raised families, whatever. I'm making things up, but you can see what I mean, right? So things like that. So how can I make them feel seen? Well, maybe you hold, again, surveys, town hall forum. We want to hear, engage in that feeling. So you could say, yes, the decision was made to tear down this building, but the structural integrity makes it unsafe for our community. We will recognize it in the future by whatever. But if you just did the flip side and said, no, we're tearing it down because, yeah, we got to get rid of it, done, point, case closed, then it's like you're starting to build those walls, right? It's like there's that defensiveness coming across, and that could be maybe written by that red personality, right? Who just cares about the facts. I don't care, get it down, take it down. But if you have that more empathetic understanding, then you can really start to make headway in that scenario. So what do you need them to know? So maybe you do need them, let them know that the structural integrity of that building was the reason why. It wasn't because of a budget concern or funding, or you couldn't afford to pay for the building. It's safety. So maybe that was the scenario. Or if it was that, then you just transparency, open and honest. And then understanding, how do you want them to respond? So do you want them to champion this? Do you want them to share that message and say, hey, you know, council has this event they're going to be hosting. They want us to come down to share our concerns and thoughts. Let's go. Or if you didn't do that, then it's kind of planting that seed that it's like, they don't care. So I'm not going to respond, or I'm going to respond on social and get PO'd, right? So again, it's just understanding your audience and how they may react to certain scenarios and situations. So this next slide is, again, once you get the presentation at the end, you can use this, but again, it's sort of a recap of how I just mentioned and what I just mentioned. So understanding that incident. So in this example, the building that has to come down, the historical site, or for whatever reason, what happened, what's happening, and what could happen. So it's framing that plan, that messaging around that. And then maybe even if there's opportunity to acknowledge that, maybe it could have gone differently. Don't be afraid to say that. Maybe that's following that. Maybe you've heard feedback that community should have been more involved. Okay, well, acknowledge and say that. I know it's hard because it's almost a feeling that you're opening yourself up, right, to potential questions. But if you're prepared to answer that, it makes it a lot easier to do. So again, people are probably thinking, oh, it's just me on my comms team, or I don't have anyone. That's sort of why we're here. We do that. We engage with people such as yourselves and help them identify and navigate and kind of go through exercises just like this to really understand. So as I mentioned, there'll be contact information. You can get a hold of me if you want to discuss more, but biggest takeaway is that you're not alone in this. It can be daunting, and the last thing you really want to do is, sometimes I've seen with communications, is that it gets pushed to the side of the desk, or it's something where it's like, oh, I'll just handle it later, and then next thing you know, things are piling up, and those little things that I talked about of maybe just having an expectation of when you're going to get back to someone posted or publicly available, that could have eliminated a lot of what you're finding yourself currently in, right? Again, that kind of a really kind of nice segue into that last point. So how can you demonstrate or take that accountability? So that can be built right into plans of accountability. So who is accountable to this plan? Who is accountable to the messaging? How are we accountable to it? In that example of the building, so we're taking accountability. We're understanding that the health and safety of the community is at risk. While we understand that this was a landmark or community kind of beacon, we'll be doing this. to make it even better or whatever, right? So it's really about understanding the incident or the issue or the topic or whatever you're trying to do. Again, you can take that, even it doesn't even have to be a crisis comms scenario. It can be what maybe you perceive as a positive thing, but if you're not explaining it out, someone could just say, oh, they're just throwing money away again, right? Or just whatever. But if you, again, that's with all that it being in someone's head, if you're not getting it out the correct way, they may not understand. It's like, oh, well, no, this actually does make sense. They're not just, because you always sometimes hear often, my tax dollars or my money, I don't want it going towards this. Well, that's always going to be a question probably in the history of time. But if you can explain and understand and be empathetic and really understand what is happening, or maybe even understanding why that's the reaction, it can go a long way as well. So sort of the next steps around those points, and even when you're looking at specifically crisis comms or even just communications planning, is this can often be seen as almost like a recap or the process after, right? So how are we handling, or how did we handle the incident, the campaign, the communication? What are we doing around that? So it's always good to reflect and think, did we really need to go like whole hog on social media when no one really, that wasn't where our audience was? Maybe not. So then you can just kind of look and adapt and change. So maybe you identify the processes. Maybe there's things that you need to change to prevent maybe some, again, we're talking like crisis scenarios, but even standard workflow. Like maybe, you know what, we spent all this time on social and it didn't do anything, when this person maybe could have been, or we could have been better served making an impact because people say they didn't see us enough in the community, or they didn't see that direct interaction. That's all communication. So what that might tell me, if that was the issue, was that you didn't, the plan, you failed to kind of see that one, maybe find that audience where maybe people wanted more face-to-face interaction rather than social. So what you could say is, okay, if we do this type of outreach or this messaging again, maybe 40 social, the rest in person, right? So what can you make, and I guess these can be referenced as commitments, and I shouldn't say guess, these can be referenced as commitments to you, not only yourself, but when you're talking to a community, what can you do to sort of maybe in crisis communications alleviate situations, or what are the next steps that people can do? So how can they connect with you? Who can they connect with? What are the channels? And this is, again, all in the communications plan, strategies, meetings with me, right? It's all identified, right? So when you're presenting those, again, how can you make good on those commitments? So it's one thing to say, you can call me at any time, but if you're not picking up the phone or if you're not responding back, then it's a fault in the planning, right? So it's really about being clear in all facets of the plan. So when you're planning, when you're doing up the plan and creating that plan, it's being clear in all the stuff after, because there is a time commitment and resources allocated to that as well. Okay, so quick little fun exercise here. So you don't have to share if you don't want to. I'm going to throw out a kind of a little scenario here, and then just really kind of look at these points and write a sentence for each of the following prompts. And if you want to share, feel free to. After, I'll give you about probably 10 minutes to come up with a few of these. And if you just wanted to share maybe one of the points you came down with, I'd love to hear it. And try to think back to those short sound bites, kind of that key messages, acknowledging. So like what we just talked about with the building, sort of recap what's happening, acknowledge, yeah, as you can see in the prompts, and I'll leave these up on the screen. But basically the scenario is, so we use municipality for our audience here. There's a water main break that is impacting a large portion of the community, and it's going to take some time to fix. So look at these points. How would you address that situation and scenario? So again, water main break, it's going to be impacting a large portion of the community. So take that If you're a small community, what does that look like? If you're Calgary, what does that look like? So just use that as the guide. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. But I'll leave the screen up so you can see those 6 points. And I'd love to hear some of what you guys come up with shortly. Okay, so I'll give you about 10 minutes and I'll come back and check in. Okay, welcome back. How's everyone doing? Did everyone have enough time to get something put together? Okay. Okay, I see that we got one here in the chat, so I'll read that one.
I was going to ask if for the statements, do you want us to dump it in the chat? Is that the idea?
No, you don't have to.
Okay.
You can read them out loud, or if you can put it in the chat if you want, but whatever.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll read the first one here. Okay, the town of Sexsmith has issued an emergency boil water advisory after E. coli bacteria was found in a water sample. According to a letter from Aquaterra Utilities posted on the village's Facebook page on Thursday, the sample was taken on September 19th from the Sexsmith water system. The presence of E. coli presents a threat to health, so provincial protocol requires the issuance of the boil water order. Water from the supply and distribution system should be boiled for at least a minute to ensure bacteriological safety for any water that may enter a person's mouth per Aquaterra. The boil water notice remains in effect until further notice. Great. Yeah, I was kind of reading and then I'm looking at the screen trying to check off the bullets there. So obviously a recap of what happened, acknowledging the people are upset and empathize. I would have, let's just see here. Could have been a little stronger on that. Maybe we understand that this impacts whatever, but still in all, a very good statement. Good job. Thanks. Anyone want to share either in the chat or they can read kind of what they put together?
Sure, I can go ahead. It's funny that one said town of Sexsmith. I'm guessing that's from the employee. So our assistant CAO who's also from the town here. And funny enough, we actually just went through this with our water, not E. coli, but a water main break sort of. So
there you go.
Anyway, recent events.
Okay.
So here's my statement. There's a water main break on the north end of the town of Sexsmith. As many of you are aware, the water service to homes throughout our community has been affected. I know that there are concerns about safety and when the water will be back on. As a fellow resident, I have the same concerns. This is a top priority for council and staff, and Aquaterra, our water utility, is working around the clock to address the issue. In the meantime, bottled water and portable fill stations are available at the fire hall and the arena. These are open 24 hours a day. Bottled water and portable toilets are being delivered to schools, seniors' homes, and doctors' office so that these can remain open. We are hoping to have the break repaired by this evening and will update again in 2 hours. The next steps may include a possible boil water advisory. This would only be a precaution and will be communicated. Please watch for updates on the radio, Facebook, and the town of Sexsmith and Aquaterra websites. Aquaterra employees are also calling every account holder to ensure everyone is safe and the right information is being shared. Thank you for your patience in this unexpected circumstance. Please reach out to me if you have any questions.
Perfect. That was great. That was really good. Yeah, no, That was, and I wasn't expecting it to be anything but no, that was very, very good. I love how you acknowledged right off the bat the impact it has on the community. Sometimes what I find in situations like this or scenarios or even anything, they organizations, municipalities, whoever, they tend to put their issues, like their feeling first, and not the feeling or the reason, and not acknowledging the community, right? So sometimes what could have been said, it could have said like, oh, the water main impact or water main break impacts break impact has affected our workers, utility services. They're going to be like whatever, that you're kind of talking everything that affects them, the town. But I like how you said that for the residents, right? So really putting it first, because that's what they're reading this for, right? It's not what they really don't care about, how it affects the infrastructure of the town at that moment, maybe later down the road, but not in the middle of it. So good job. Anyone else like to share?
I don't mind to share one. And hearing the last one, I think, oh, I didn't mention this or that in my sentences, like the update idea.
That's
so this
the reason why we share, right? Yeah, that's exactly what you hear. You just hear things and from others. So all good.
So
No
here's,
worries.
I'll share then, and I wrote it in a structured way based
Yep.
on your 6 numbers.
Sure.
So I'll say each number as I go.
Okay.
So number 1, a water main break on 33rd Street has seriously impacted over 100 residents' access to fresh water. Number 2, this is already very disruptive to many families, and it is our town's urgent focus to stabilize the water main infrastructure so that the repairs can happen as quickly as possible. Number 3, the Public Works Department has put every employee possible on this project, and the town is coordinating with our emergency measures group to coordinate any other help we can get from our other departments and our neighboring communities. Number 4, the mayor and council are being briefed fully on each step of the plan and have authorized immediate reallocation of staff and resources to make sure emergency access to water is being delivered as soon as possible to the affected residents and that repairs begin immediately. And number 5, anything we can learn from the situation will be used to make sure our budget is used well to prevent this situation from ever occurring again. Water is a top priority for all of our town residents. And number 6, thank you to every resident for your patience and to any others who might be affected during the repair work. Thank you also for helping your neighbors and friends through this difficult time. So there was a couple comments.
Perfect.
Bullets.
That was written. No, and how did it feel kind of when because if you read that, it wouldn't sound like you just went the bullets. So how did that feel like writing it through? Like I find it helps if you sort of use that as a guide, because what it does is barring some minor tweaks, but it really puts it into a nice structure. So maybe Ian, how did you feel about that? Maybe open to the larger group. How did you feel seeing that? Like, is it easier to understand when you're maybe tasked with writing a message or a statement?
Yeah, like saying the numbers didn't feel right, but I just did that so you knew where I was going
totally
along.
no. Yeah.
And maybe I have a question about that in a second. But yes, the idea of using the 6 forced me to think of every angle that is needed in a message. Who else would be wondering about this?
Mm-hmm.
Or, like even just the idea of acknowledging a responsibility. I'm not positive I would have had a statement in that if I was writing a press release or standing at a microphone, necessarily say that. But one question I have is the order of these 6 in your mind critical in a press release, or is it more just that we're hitting all 6? Like,
so hitting all 6, sometimes the order will change based on the situation, right? So if it's an impactful scenario on community, then you should have the people component higher up the list. If it's more of maybe a message that you're just getting out about town infrastructure and update, then you can, again, it's just what is important in that scenario or that setting. So the order isn't, obviously the thank you would, it's a nice way to end it and close it, but feel free to, based on the scenarios, you can move around the order of the bullets or the what you're trying to say. So it's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Any other comments?
I was just going to add, I appreciated, so I've been the mayor for a while in our community, and so I've been through a number of these, but what I appreciated about your list specifically is that it helps to keep things concise so that you're not oversharing, because oftentimes I think, especially as elected officials, we talk too much probably. I mean, I'll speak for myself in that, but I can be an oversharer. And so I really appreciated that it helps keep you focused on what's important. And, you know, like when I looked at handwritten, I had one page just of handwritten, like it looks huge and full, but it's written larger so I can read it off, whatever. But then it really keeps me focused on what's important. So it's just keeping those pieces in line and making sure you hit all the major points, which is critical.
No, that's, I mean, I use this still to this day, like when we're dealing with mainly crisis stuff, but you can even use it in any form of messaging, like even if it's a positive or you're announcing a new, maybe there's a launch of a new park, all right, you can still use this formula as a way to frame it. So you could still recap why it's happening, and instead of it's not ideal, why is it ideal, right? So you can still use this framework as a way to get the positive news out there as well. So you'd still acknowledge responsibility in positive scenarios, right, and situations. You can even recap how you handled that, even if maybe there was the building of the park, there was maybe some objection, you could acknowledge that. So what that does is it acknowledges the other side as well. So yeah, it's you can use it for all kinds, not just water main breaks or other hard, tough situations. Great. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Okay. All right, so we're coming up to the end here. So I just want to do a quick little summary and summation of everything that I sort of talked about, and then we can also open up to if there's any other questions or comments, thoughts, feedback, anything you maybe need clarification on. But the biggest thing is just, my biggest thing is just it's planning in general. So whether your communications plan is, like I said, a 15-page template that has all this, or it's a 2-page document, or whatever fits for you, that you've identified all the stuff that you need, whatever works for you, and you find that you're kind of in a groove with it, fine. It doesn't need to be this massive document or thing that's overwhelming and daunting, and you don't have to take everything I said and make sure it's in your plan. Sometimes it's irrelevant and it doesn't make sense. So it's really about understanding what you need, especially in certain situations that would warrant more in-depth plans. So a crisis communications plan, yes, I would say it should be larger than maybe 2 pages, but as long as it's documented and it's there, yeah, go for it. So the biggest thing in whatever plan or process you put in place is really about looking at those points that I mentioned, the documentation. So really understanding where we're at, of kind of, maybe we're starting from ground level of communications planning, don't have anything, or we're refreshing one. Really understanding that process and what needs to be in it, kind of documenting the steps within that plan. Getting a good understanding and grip of what technology is available to you, and what isn't, and what makes sense and what doesn't, right? So understanding those. Training, so training of the plan, as I mentioned before, it's one thing to prepare the plan, and then if you never revisit it, or if you're not using it, or if you're not consistent in using it, that's another thing. So training, so if there's, like I said, if you do have a staff, ensure that this is the way that they're preparing communications plans, they're utilizing that plan, that template, they're using the things that you've identified in that, because one thing, as I mentioned before, it'll build consistency, not only within the municipality or organization or department, but in that consistency, it also reflects in the messaging and the way that you're communicating with people, and people will see that if there's a constant flow and it's making sense and there's a general cadence to it, that they'll be respectful of that, and they'll get it. And then the last point here under that section is people. So understanding the people that you have, or the people that you need, or the support that you might need, and what do those skills that those people have, where do they fit into those buckets of communication? So who would be best served? And sometimes it's hard because one person does it all. So maybe in looking at that, maybe it's looking at the skills they have and talking to that person about improving things or focusing on other areas, right? So it's really about understanding the people, and people can be yourself. So if it's you're the one-man band on this, what do you maybe need to improve upon to understand social media better, or writing news releases, or preparing for media interviews? Just identifying those things that maybe you'd want to build upon to improve your overall communications for the organization. Again, so when we talked about communication, it's one thing to have that one way, but make sure it's open. So keep those lines of communication available, and make sure that if you are asking people to visit a website or contact you, make sure that the way and the means that they are using to contact you work. So again, you can go back in those slides and see those little tips on your website of what to kind of make sure is working. Biggest thing, if you have a contact form, make sure it goes somewhere and someone's regularly checking it, responding to it. And then also, again, those last 2 points there of social media, same thing, understanding who checks it, who posts, how do we respond, what are we responding to, the timeline, time frame. And then managing, I'm going to say it says media, but managing all relationships. So how do we manage those media relationships, those relationships with community, relationships with people on Facebook, relationships with people that always call or want to talk to the mayor, people who show up to every council meeting because maybe they just like the sense of community. Who knows? It's just understanding that, right? So managing those relationships and being aware of that as well. The big one that I wanted to highlight right at the top there, don't just speak, but listen. So really taking in that feedback and understanding why people are saying what they're saying. Why are they at this point in time that they may come across as being negative, or they're upset, or so what led to that? Was it because there was no communication of how long it would take to get back to someone? Did you just ignore their email for a fear of saying the wrong thing? Like these are all things to take into consideration, right? So when building out the plan, maybe the reason why you're building the communications plan is because there was a lack of communication. No one ever got back to anyone, or maybe it was sort of good, but it can be room for improvement. So it's really about understanding the why behind it, right? So maybe you just have to rebuild that trust, and then it'll make a life easier. So also on those points too, be aware of your biases. So sometimes it's really hard, especially when we're looking at a situation, positive or negative, to kind of almost be that term, that steady Eddie, right down the middle. You don't want to go too far, even in a positive scenario where, again, that example of launching a new park, maybe you think this is the best thing ever to happen to the town and it's amazing. Well, sometimes people may not necessarily feel like that. So it's just understanding that bias in your planning and your messaging and acknowledging both sides. So it's being aware of that. As soon as you're aware of that, it'll be amazing. It'll be like a light bulb goes off and you think, maybe about how should we handle the people that don't want this, right? So again, because that inevitably could probably come up. That being said, make your community feel heard. So if there is a group, again, that doesn't want this, acknowledge them, make them feel heard, talk, understand the reasons of why, because then what's happening is you're avoiding that, they don't care about us, they don't, whatever. So it's just acknowledging that side of it as well. Preparedness in general. So yes, to speak to media, but be prepared to speak to whomever, and using those messages to really improve your communication. So tightening those up, that exercise was, I hope everyone found that helpful, but that's one thing that we still use, is using those points to tighten up the message. Whether it's in front of the camera, whether it's posted online, whether it's via social, whether it's, you might run into someone down the street and they might ask you about the water main break. Well, if you have, not saying you have to, well, the town of the, like, but if you have those points sort of in your head, then it's easier to kind of be able to communicate effectively. Because then what happens too, sometimes if you're not prepared, you could say something that could be turned around and someone might post on social, oh, I just ran into the mayor and they told me that the water main break is actually it's going to take about 6 months to fix, not 24 hours. Like, whoa. So just making sure that everyone's on the same page in that regard too. So the competence of the project, not only just the deliverable project, but the planning, everything ahead of time, the competence of your plan. If it's not easily explained, so if someone's reading this and there's confusion around the tactics or the strategy around it, well, maybe we have to go back to that drawing board of how we do our plans again. So back to that reviewing of the plan. Do we have too much in it? Do we need this? So it's always kind of looking at that and adapting as you go. So when you're in kind of that planning of messaging, looking at projects, looking at maybe responding to an angry resident, or just maybe informing your audience on a positive, maybe you're going to be holding, so relevant would be a Christmas market or something that, whatever it is, the messaging has to be clear, consistent, and you should be reflecting on these points: the audience, the issue or the incident. So positive, negative, what is it? So reflecting. So an example of the Christmas market, what are we doing? Like, what's the reason for this? Who are we hoping to attract? Why are we doing this? Because then maybe some people will be like, again, it always sometimes goes back to that, they're wasting our money on this stupid market or whatever. Why are we doing this? What's the point, right? And then acknowledging the next steps following things. So it's one thing, like I said before, one thing to get the message out there, but how are we reacting? Are we taking feedback? After, again, this example of the market, if we find that no one attended because maybe people were right, they didn't want it, how do we address that? So it's understanding that there's communication, but there's always continuing that chain of it, right? So maybe it's contacting people directly, if they had a positive experience, even too. Like if you see comments on, sometimes what I see, a lot of people, they don't treat the positive feedback with as much energy as negative. Sometimes you get so fired up when you see a negative comment or a call or tweet or email. You put all your energy into it, you might overthink it, you're freaking out. But then when you get like a positive note, or a message could be like, oh, I'm going to say town of Sexsmith, great job on that. You guys nailed it. It's sometimes I see crickets, I'm not saying you guys, but other areas, it's like, it could be no response. And a simple could be like, oh, thank you so much. You know, it was great for our community. A lot of people, when hard work went into this, you build that line of communication. So it's just not one way, even on positivity, right? So always good to keep that in mind as well. It never really ends. You're always just continuing the conversation. Awesome. Does anyone have any questions? We're almost out of time.
I'll just say I appreciate the going through this. I've been through a few different ones, and I appreciate the very practical and hands-on approach that I know sometimes this you get a lot of theory, but making sure that it translates into something that's actually usable is really important. The point about acknowledging your bias, especially even on good projects. So I just went through this where, it was like this great news story. Everybody's been looking forward to this for a long time. And suddenly it's like, we met with a bit of resistance, and that was unexpected. And so it's like, oh yeah, we never even thought about it from that angle. So I appreciated that reminder, because that one I think is a hard one, especially when it's a positive thing. You expect it on certain things, especially like in particular ones that seem controversial, but like ours was a new stormwater berm with a walking trail on top. Like I thought this could not,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
there
but-
were some.
no,
Yeah.
the person who lives right behind, I don't want that. It's gonna impact my view of whatever, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, really appreciated that. I did just want to make two comments. One, regarding council and staff, and sometimes the difficulties that's there on the communication side, because the role of both is so different.
Yep.
And I know sometimes that can create some tension. So I don't know if you're able to speak to that even just briefly, but it is
Sure.
one that we've faced a few times and have had to work through as a community, even to like how communication comes from how it goes to public, but then also making sure it comes back to council, or council not overstepping their role. Like there's a fine line there.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing, especially when we're talking about municipalities and council, more often than not everyone is united or on the same page. There's always going to be differing opinions. And that's the beauty of democracy in council. There's always going to be people who have different thoughts, questions. So the biggest challenge that kind of we've seen sometimes is, especially too, whether it's Alchemy or whether it's the town communications department, they sometimes often we write like messaging that encompasses all of council, right? Where it says council. So, and sometimes I've heard like people are like, well, no, I don't really support that. So there's this butting of heads in the message sometimes, but you have to be unified. Like, and I know it's really hard because you're trying to achieve this. Like I'm saying all this stuff about you got to be positive and get this and listen to people. But if someone isn't on board with that or following in line, how do you handle that? So no, I definitely hear it. And one, I think another big confusing thing is that, so like you said, there's a department and then there's council, and they have different ways of doing things. Some council members go out all the time and communicate and talk, and you can't really control that. Like sometimes they could say, can you try and stick to the key message? Like they might be like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm just going to talk to my people, right? Right. So it's hard sometimes, but I think the biggest thing is just to have that. There's not a perfect way to do this. It's just, but as long as there's understanding and communication around the reason behind things sometimes, or maybe on the flip side with that council person who likes to talk to everyone and could care less about key messages, maybe the communications person should hear that and understand that and maybe build that plan for that person or whatever, right? So yeah, no, it's definitely a challenge, but it's a fun challenge. So I think if you look at it that way, and I know it can be hard, like, what are you talking about? This is fun, like what? But it's good to look at it like, it's not an insurmountable task. It's challenging, yes, sometimes, but it can be rewarding for sure.
The only other note I'll make is just something we've instituted now within the town is sort of an editor policy. Like it's worked to make sure that anything that is going out, the staff generally, unless it's in an imminent crisis, it always comes either to me first or to another, like for sure it goes to our CAO, but I often get it too, because sometimes how something is said is really important. And again, acknowledging the difference between council and staff, and we're in the political realm and staff are in the technical or the operational realm. And so making sure both sides are covered. And so having that editor position or role is such a critical piece to making sure that whatever is out there, and that there's no like easy typo issues, because that just drives me crazy.
Totally. Yeah. And that, again, that can go all the way back to your planning, right? So if you built that in, and because that's usually the one thing, or the easiest thing to be picked on is spelling and grammar sometimes. And it could be an easy way someone maybe who is already kind of ticked off, they could say, oh, look at, they can't even spell this right. Like, what the heck? So I always use the example, and you got to think of it. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's almost like, so if you go to a restaurant and you go there and you're routinely getting like undercooked food, or it's like that they keep making the same mistake over and over and over, you're going to be more likely to start talking about it or commenting about it. So it could be as little as a spelling mistake or consistency issues in communications, right? If you're consistently doing that, then it's like building. And you should be seen like, so the restaurant example, you don't want to serve raw undercooked food. You don't, and so in communications, you don't want spelling mistakes. So yeah, we say, it's just a mistake, or, but you should treat that as the same way as a restaurant maybe serving undercooked meat, right? So if you look at it that way, then it's easier to sort of think, yeah, that's unacceptable, right? We can't be, we're trying to portray this, we can't have a mistake, right? So yeah. Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, so here is my contact info on this slide here. Feel free to email me, call me, text me, whatever, if you want to talk more about this presentation, or if there's some specific things that are kind of happening in your world that you're unsure of and you want to maybe feedback, advice, seeing if we could potentially support or whatever. I'm always open for a chat. So yeah, email, phone, whatever works best for you. So I really enjoyed my presentation to you guys today, and I really hope that you took something out of it. Even just that exercise, if you found that useful, or even a few things that I said, if you found that helpful. I hope it was of benefit. So thanks again for spending 2 hours with me this morning, and everyone have a great rest of your day and happy holidays coming up. Thanks.